Okay, thanks. And thanks those who've joined. My name's Stephen Broad. I've worked for about 3 decades in wildlife trade research and action. I led Traffic, an NGO working on wildlife trade issues until earlier this year. And now I'm an independent consultant. And among other things, I'm finding opportunities to promote and carry out research that provides insights into challenges and solutions related to trade from nature. Today, we're meant to be focusing on undermining serious and organised crime, although we debated that earlier in this group, and drawing upon the quest for understanding. We talked about that yesterday. So I'm going to try in this limited time to take on this challenge with a particular focus on illegal wildlife trade. Just remember to switch on my timer. There you go. I should be clear from my perspective, this is a full spectrum issue. This is blue, green, and red. It encompasses illegal trade in wild plants and animals from marine and terrestrial realms. So first, a critical starting point in motivating action that might undermine any sector of serious and organised crime is to be clear why it matters. What's the harm that it's causing and what the benefits would be of doing without this serious and organised crime. For illegal wildlife trade, there's a complicated answer to that question. The potential harms are diverse, as illustrated on this slide. I stress this in order to illustrate that drivers for remedial measures are also similarly diverse. So you can look at, for wildlife trade, you can look at a conservation perspective, which is where a lot of the environmental law and regulation related to wildlife trade comes from. This is trying to address the issue of overexploitation, which we know is one of the major threats to nature conservation. But there's a range of other harms in terms of impacts on natural capital, lost revenue from legal exploitation, undermining livelihoods, insecurity, and attracting organised crime, corruption, security, and health problems. I refer to this in the slide to this World Bank study done a couple of years ago, which concluded that if you look at the services that are not even priced into the market and just look at this from an economic point of view, then this problem could be causing damage of $1 trillion a year or more. So I stress this again, the diversity of the ways of looking at the harm reflected in the response. Much wildlife trade regulation is trying to address the harm of overexploitation, but some regulation aims to protect animal and human health and welfare. And when viewed in terms of livelihoods or security or crime prevention, again, the approach and the definition of harm may be different. These perspectives are important because they drive the priorities that are being followed in terms of strategies to address wildlife crime, illegal wildlife trade. But they're often in tension, and that's the point I want to make here, is what matters most and what should be the highest priority. Is it the smuggling of the last dozen specimens of a rare turtle or a rare orchid, which will produce massive conservation impact, but it's not something that's causing massive proceeds from crime? Which is the priority there? The proceeds from crime and the drivers from crime and the significance in that respect, or the conservation significance? And the conservation significance is obviously severe and irreversible. When we look at solutions to why this, we could talk all day, much beyond the time I have available, about the reasons why this problem persists. But first, I'll just say for now that a lot has been done, particularly through regulation nationally and through things like CITES, the Wildlife Trade Convention, intervention efforts by governments, support by NGOs, and more recently, more action by private sector. But the increase in effort has been overwhelmed, really, by the changes and the pace of change in the world, the pace of change in the global economy, the changes in the movements of goods, the movements of money, the movements of people, emerging supply and demand drivers. As a good colleague often says, but still, this is not rocket science. It's not rocket science to resolve, but it'll take more effort, more investment, collaboration, and intelligent design to sort out. So onto this diagram, one of my interests is to encourage a more systematic approach to illegal wildlife trade interventions, and indeed those for other areas of wildlife trade. I've been trying to look at how to use a trade chain approach and look at interventions in the logic of a trade chain and obviously the logic of a crime intervention strategy, and the incentives, how those affect the incentives and possibilities for the participants, from producers to traders, processors, retailers, and consumers. And this helps us to be a lot clearer about strategy, about how these incentives interact with each other, how the interventions interact with each other, and help us be more systematic in assessing the net impact to the problem that we're trying to tackle. Again, taking into account that problem may be defined by different institutions and people in different ways. So looking at this model, I'm just going to use three quick examples to illustrate how that might play out. First one is Ivory trade, and this was picked up in a presentation yesterday. I want to note in terms of how research and understanding can lead to better interventions, the role of looking at seizure analysis around the ivory trade, how that helps us understand trends in the market, and lets us understand where the different countries, markets, producer countries are at a crude level. But some science I wanted to point to here, and I'll share a link afterwards. The paper is in tiny type in the corner, is work by Sam Wasser and others looking at forensic analysis based on sampling of ivory from seizures, which combined with a database of elephant tusks from source, has allowed pinpointing of where the ivory in ivory seizures is actually coming from. And so that links back to the story yesterday, to the Selous region and around that region, Mozambique, in Tanzania, but also to Central Africa. And you can see how now that's changing over time in response to the interventions, and it's helping to target law enforcement interventions better, and the policy interventions around that in terms of which countries should be held more accountable around compliance mechanisms. A second example, to go quickly, is on abalone trade. This is an example of a blue issue in wildlife trade. Abalone is a high value shellfish, and a lot of research has been done looking at South Africa in particular, where there's a highly criminalized industry, organized crime driving that, and causing massive problems for the resource, but also significant harms within communities. There's a long history to this, feeding off the regulation of fisheries in South Africa, and also to the high value markets in Asia. But some work I highlight here has been to look at prisoner interviews and offender interviews to try and understand much better what are the behavioral drivers for the participants. And again, and how do they interact with each other? Where is the relationship between the Chinese buyers in this case and the South African harvesters, poachers, traders, organizers? Where does that link together? And then how does that help lead to better law enforcement action in terms of getting to the right parts of the trade chain, but also looking at the incentives? Why are people involved in the trade? A lot of this relates to unemployment and other economic constraints. My third case study quickly is looking at rhino horn demand. And here again, looking at behavior at the market end and highlighting research. There's an increasing body of research. There's a great website here called changewildlifeconsumers.org. I put the link in the page yesterday, where there's an attempt to pull together such research, looking at consumer motivation. So using different methods of looking at consumer motivations. And in this case, some research that's led into an intervention, a consumer behavior change modification intervention in Vietnam called the Chi campaign, where the consumer research has helped identify a typical consumer, Mr. L, and then a lot of the behavior change interventions that have been taken on the basis of that have been really focused on a much tighter understanding of who the consumer is, what is driving that consumer's behaviors, and what can be and what might influence that consumer's behavior. So again, these are three examples really of trying to think systematically about the challenge, and looking at how you apply the research base into driving interventions and thinking about how those interventions come together. So again, in summary, I would just say I believe a better understanding and good design are critically important if we're to make effective interventions. That requires good design. It requires some evaluation over time, particularly longer time periods than often looked at the moment, as we noted earlier, if we can undermine illicit markets and associated crime. So thanks for listening. I'm happy to take any questions.